The whole town of Cedar Hollow was standing on the courthouse steps the morning they meant to take everything he had, and not one of them expected the scarred man to speak. He stood at the front of that crowd, with the burned side of his face turned into the wind, holding the hand of a woman who could not hear a single word the auctioneer was shouting. And when the gavel came up, he lifted his own hand instead, and said, in a voice like a fence post going into hard ground, "Before you sell my life out from under me, you'll answer for the lie you told to get it." They laughed. They'd been laughing at him for a year. They laughed the day he rode in, with half his face ruined by fire, and they laughed harder the day he chose the deaf widow over every whole and hearing woman in the valley. And they were laughing still, right up until the moment the truth walked out of the back of that courtroom on its own 2 feet. But I'm getting ahead of the story. And a story like this one deserves to be told slow, the way you would bank a fire to last the whole long night. So let me ask you first, before we begin, wherever you are tonight, whatever town or country or quiet room you are sitting in, take a moment and tell me in the comments the name of the place you are listening from, because I like to know who is gathered around this fire with me. Subscribe if you have not, and stay with me all the way to the end, because the people who leave early always miss the part that matters most. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, to the year the drought broke, and a stranger came down off the ridge road into a valley that did not want him. His name was Elias Crane, and the first thing anyone in Cedar Hollow ever knew about him was the wrong thing. They knew his face. The left side of it was as ordinary as any man's, weathered brown, a little stubborn around the jaw, gray coming into the temple like frost into a field. But the right side had been through a fire, years before, in a place he never named, and the skin there had healed the way land heals after a burn, pulled tight, ridged, pale in some places and dark in others. The eye pulled down just slightly at the corner, so that he always looked as if he were squinting against a sun no one else could see. Children stared. Grown men looked once, and then looked away, and told themselves they were being polite. Women crossed the street. And Elias Crane, who had learned a long time ago that a man cannot argue a crowd out of what its stomach has already decided, simply rode on through the middle of Main Street with his back straight and his hat low and his eyes fixed on the far end of town where the livery stood. And he did not give any of them the satisfaction of watching him flinch. He had $11 in his coat and a bill of sale in his saddlebag for a ranch he had never seen, a hard-scrabble 160 acres up against the base of the mountains that a dying man in a distant town had sold him cheap because nobody local would touch it. Bad water, they had said. Bad luck. A place where 3 men had already broken themselves trying to make it pay. Elias had heard all of that and bought it anyway, because a man with a face like his does not get to be choosy about where the world will let him stand, and because he had spent 11 years drifting from one man's payroll to another, building other men's fences and mending other men's roofs and sleeping in other men's bunkhouses, and he had reached the age where a body wants a piece of ground it can call its own before it lies down in the last piece of ground of all. So he rode up the ridge road that first evening, with the light going gold and then rose behind him. And he came at last to the place that was his, and he sat his horse a long while looking at it. It was worse than they had said. The house was a low log thing, with the sod roof half fallen in and a door hanging on one hinge. The barn had burned at some point and never been rebuilt, just a black square of old char and a few standing posts like the ribs of something dead. The corral fence was down in 3 places, and the creek that was supposed to water the whole 160 ran thin and brown along the eastern line, choked with fallen timber and beaver dam and a summer's worth of neglect. Any sensible man would have turned around. Elias Crane got down off his horse, walked to the creek, crouched, and put his hand into the thin, brown water. He held it there a while. Then he stood up, wiped his hand on his trousers, and said to the empty valley, in the flat voice of a man making a promise he intends to keep, "You will run clear before winter." And that was the first thing he ever did on that land. Not curse it, not weep over it, just make it one honest promise and get to work. Now I want you to understand something about Elias Crane, because it is the whole engine of this story, and if you miss it, you will miss everything. He was not a lucky man. He had never once in his life been handed a thing. Every skill he owned he had bought with blood or time. How to read the way water wants to move across a slope. How to set a post so it holds through the frost heave. How to gentle a horse that another man had ruined. How to butcher and salt and mend and doctor and go without. He was, though nobody in that valley would learn it for a long while, one of the most competent men ever to set foot in Cedar Hollow. And competence, real competence, the kind that is earned and not bragged about, has a quiet to it. It does not announce itself. It just does the next thing, and then the next, until one day the people who laughed look up and find that the man they wrote off has built something none of them could build. But that was later. That first night he slept in the sound part of the house, with his saddle for a pillow and a small fire in the broken hearth, and a lean gray dog with a torn ear came out of the timber sometime past midnight and stood in the doorway watching him. It had belonged to one of the men who had failed here, most likely, left behind when the failing was done. Elias did not reach for it or coax it. He just moved his saddlebag a little to make room by the fire and went back to sleep. In the morning, the dog was lying against his back, and it never left him again. Animals know before people do. Remember that. It is going to matter. He named the dog Nothing at first, because a man who has learned not to hope is careful about what he lets himself keep. But within a week, he was calling it Gray, which was not so much a name as a description that had worn itself into one. And Gray answered to it. And that was the first of the small, warm things Elias Crane let back into his life without quite meaning to. The days that followed the first were all the same shape, and I want to walk you through one of them, because a life is not built in the big moments. It is built in the ordinary ones. And if you do not understand how Elias Crane spent an ordinary day, you will not understand how he earned everything that came after. He woke before the light, always, a habit 11 years of other men's schedules had beaten into him so deep it had become his own. He built the fire back up from the banked coals and set the coffee on, and stood in the doorway with the tin cup warming his split hands, and watched the dark drain out of the valley, and the first gray come up over the eastern rim. And he did not think about much of anything, because he had learned that a man who thinks too much in the dark hour thinks himself into places he cannot climb out of. Then he went to work. There was always work. The roof first, because a man cannot build a life under a sky that leaks. He stripped the fallen sod and cut new poles from the timber up the draw, and laid them true, and re-thatched and re-sodded. And when it was done, the house was dry for the first time in 3 years. And he stood inside it in a hard rain a week later, and listened to the water run off clean, and felt something that he would not have called happiness, because he had put that word away a long time ago. But that was near enough to it that he had to go back outside and split wood until the feeling passed. Then the door. Hung true on new hinges, he shaped himself from an old wagon iron. Then the corral. The 3 down places built back stronger than the rest. Then the well, cleaned and cased, and the sweep rebuilt. And through all of it, in the back of his mind, running like the creek itself, was the water. Because the water was the whole thing. The water was why 3 men had failed, and why the ground was cheap, and why, if there was any making this place pay at all, it would be made or lost on the water. Let me tell you about the water now, because the water is where Elias Crane first showed this valley what he was made of, and because I promised you competence, and I mean to keep every promise this story makes. For 3 weeks, that man worked the creek from the property line up into the timber, alone but for Gray. And what he did up there no one in town saw, and no one would have understood if they had. He cleared the fallen timber that was damming the flow and rotting the water brown. He broke out the old beaver works and rebuilt the channel where it had spread itself thin and wasteful across a flat and gone to swamp. He found, half a mile up, the place where the real trouble was. A slump of hillside from some old spring flood that had shoved the creek out of its bed and set it wandering, losing itself in gravel and sun. And there, with a pick and a shovel and a mule he traded 2 days' labor for, one man moved what looked like an impossible amount of earth, cutting the water a new deep channel down the line it had wanted all along. Walling it with stone he pried from the hillside and set by hand, tight, no mortar, the old way. Either it holds or it does not. He worked from gray light to dark. He ate little. His hands split and healed and split again and grew a hide on them like harness leather. There were days the work went backward, when a wall he had set gave way in the night, and he came up in the morning to find the water muddy and spread again, and a week's labor undone. And on those days he did not curse, and he did not quit. He just crouched by the ruin of it, and studied why it had failed. Because a thing that fails is only telling you the truth about how it was built. And then he built it again, differently, better. That is a kind of patience most men do not have. That is the patience of a man who has already lost everything once, and has therefore stopped being afraid of losing an afternoon. I should tell you what those weeks cost him beyond the labor, because a story that shows you only the work and not the loneliness of the work has not shown you the man. In all that time he spoke to almost no one. He went into town twice, both times for tools and provisions he could not do without. And both times it was the same. The liveryman took his money and would not quite look at him. The children by the mercantile went quiet and pointed when they thought he could not see, and their mothers pulled them close. A group of men outside the saloon watched him ride the length of the street, and one of them said something, and the others laughed. And Elias Crane did not turn his head, did not slow his horse, did not give them 1 inch of the satisfaction they were fishing for. But do not think it did not touch him. It touched him. A man does not grow a hide so thick that the laughter of strangers cannot reach through it. He only grows a hide thick enough that they cannot see it reach through. And at night, up on the ridge, alone but for a dog and a fire and the cold sound of the water he was learning to love, he would sometimes let himself feel the whole weight of it. The 11 years of bunkhouses, the 11 years of being the back that other men turned to, the whole long stretch of a life spent building warmth for other families and sleeping outside it. And he would look into the fire and ask himself the question a man in his position asks, which is not, why me? Because he had given up on why me a long time ago, but rather, Is this all there is going to be? Is this the whole shape of it? A hard man on hard ground, wanting nothing, keeping to the open where nothing can fall on him, until the last piece of ground of all. And here is the thing I most want you to see about him in those first weeks, before there was any widow or any love or any hope to sustain him. He kept working anyway. He did not have a single reason to believe the ground would ever love him back. He had no promise of a warm room or a full table, or a hand laid gently against the burned side of his face. He had nothing but the work itself and the honesty of it, the simple fact that a stone set right stays set, and water led true runs true, and he clung to that. Because when a man has lost his faith in people, the last faith left to him is often his faith in the work of his own hands, in the plain, incorruptible fact that either it holds or it does not. And Elias Crane held on to that faith through those cold, lonely weeks, the way a drowning man holds a floating spar, and it carried him. And I have known people in my own life who were carried through their darkest stretch by nothing grander than the discipline of doing the next small, honest thing. And if that is you tonight, if the only thing keeping you upright right now is the plain work in front of your hands, then I want you to know that it is enough, that it has carried better people than either of us through longer nights than this, and that the warmth, when it comes, and it can come, tends to come to exactly the person who kept doing the work when there was no reason to believe warmth was coming at all. The seasons turned while he worked. He had come in high summer with the light long and gold, and by the time the channel was near done, the aspens up the draw had gone to yellow, and the mornings had a bite in them. And the valley below spread out under him in its turning colors, the hay gone tawny, the cottonwoods along the low creeks flaming out, the far peaks getting their first white. It was beautiful country, hard and beautiful, the two things so often being the same thing. And Elias Crane, crouched at his channel in the sharp, bright mornings, began, without quite noticing, to feel the first thin thread of a thing he had not felt in 11 years, which was not happiness, not yet, but its distant cousin, the sense of a place. This ridge, this water, this dog. His breath smoking in the cold, his hands on his own stone, his own light coming up over his own eastern rim. Somewhere to be. He would not have called it that, but it was that. It was the very beginning of that. And a man who has spent 11 years with nowhere to be does not forget the first morning he feels the ground under him turn, quietly, into somewhere. And on the 22nd day, he leaned on his shovel at the top of that new channel and watched the water gather itself and run down the line he had made for it. And it ran clear. Clear and cold and steady. The way it had run before 3 men and a bad decade choked it. Clear all the way down past the broken house and out along the eastern line. And Gray barked once at the sound of it, which was the only celebration either of them allowed. Elias crouched at the bank the way he had that first evening and put his hand in. And this time, the water ran clean and cold between his fingers. And he said, quiet, the way you would speak to someone you had made a promise to. There now. You will run clear before winter, he had said. It was not yet the end of summer. Now, understand, the town did not see any of this. The town saw only that the creek that fed the lower ranches, which had been running low and foul all summer, one day came clear and full again. And the men downstream scratched their heads and thanked the weather and went on. But there was one person who understood exactly what had happened, because she lived on the little parcel directly below his, a strip of 10 acres, and a tight, small house that her husband had left her when the fever took him 2 winters back. And she had spent those 2 winters watching the water she depended on die a little more each season. Her name was Nora Vale. And Nora Vale had not heard a bird or a voice or a hoof beat or a spoken word since she was 6 years old, when a fever came through her childhood home and took from her all sound. She was 31 that summer. She was slight and straight-backed, and she wore her dark hair pinned up plain, and she had a stillness about her that people mistook for coldness because they did not understand that a person who lives in silence learns to hold very still in order to feel the world through her feet and her skin and her eyes. To read a room the way a hearing person never has to learn to read one. Nora Vale missed nothing. She saw the flicker in a face that the face's owner did not know was there. She felt a horse coming up the road through the soles of her feet before it crested the rise. And she had learned, in 25 years of silence and 2 years of widowhood, and a lifetime of being talked about as if she could not see the talking, exactly how much this valley thought she was worth. Which was not much. A pity. A poor deaf widow on 10 dry acres, too proud to sell and go be a burden to relatives back east, hanging on out there alone like the last leaf on a branch. That is what they thought of Nora Vale. But I will tell you what they did not know about her, because it is the other half of this story, and it deserves its telling as much as his does. They did not know that her husband, a gentle, plain farmer named Samuel, who had married her over his own family's objections and never once regretted it, had spent the 6 good years of their marriage learning her language, sign by sign, the same slow way Elias would later learn it, so that Nora Vale, alone of all the deaf people that hard country had ever ground down, had known for 6 years what it was to be spoken to in her own tongue, to be talked with and not merely at, to be a full and answered soul in her own home. And they did not know that when Samuel died of the fever 2 winters back, she had lost not only a husband, but the only voice in the whole valley that had ever reached her, and that she had gone, in a single week, from a woman who was spoken to every day to a woman who might go a month without a single true word, buying her flour in pantomime, nodding at mouths she could not always read, more alone in her silence than she had been even as a deaf child, because now she knew exactly what she had lost. That is grief, friend, not the absence of the person, the absence of the way they made you feel seen. And Nora Vale had carried that particular grief for 2 years, the way you carry a stone in your shoe on a road you cannot get off of. And she had told herself, the way the wounded tell themselves, that it was over for her, that Samuel had been a miracle, and miracles do not come twice, that she would live out her days on 10 acres in a silence no one would ever again bother to cross. And then the water came clear. A woman who lives by that water was not going to let it come clear again without learning why. She walked the property line one morning early, following the creek up, and she found him where the new channel started, kneeling in the gravel, resetting a stone that the current had shifted in the night. He did not hear her, which was its own small joke, that the deaf woman came up on the man silent, and it was he who did not hear. But he felt gray stir, and he looked up, and there she stood on the far bank, with the morning light behind her, a slight woman in a gray dress, with her chin up and her eyes going over his work, not over his face, he noticed, his ruined face that everyone's eyes went to first and then fled from, over his work, the channel and the stone and the clean running water, reading it the way he would have read it himself, and he watched her understand exactly what he had done and exactly what it had cost. She did not speak. He did not know yet that she could not. She simply looked at the water a long moment, and then she looked at him, and she brought her right hand up and touched it flat to the center of her own chest, and then moved it out toward him, open, the way you would hand a thing across. He did not know the sign, but he understood it, the way you understand water and weather and animals, below words. It meant thank you. It meant something more than thank you. And Elias Crane, who had not been thanked for anything in longer than he could rightly remember, who was so unused to plain human gratitude that it went into him like cold water into a split, just nodded, once, and touched the brim of his hat, and went back to his stone, because he did not trust his own face in that moment, and he had spent a lifetime learning to hide his face. That was the first time they met. No word passed between them, because one of them had no words to give, and the other had long ago stopped expecting to be given any. And yet something passed between them all the same, across that clear, cold, running water. And if you have ever in your life been truly seen by another person, not looked at, seen, then you know already that it is the rarest thing in the world, and that it does not require a single spoken word. Tell me, honestly, in the comments as this goes on, has it ever happened to you? Have you ever been seen like that, just once, when you needed it? Hold on to the memory. We are going to need it later. She came again 3 days after, and this time she brought bread. It was wrapped in a clean cloth, still warm, a dense, dark loaf of the kind that keeps, and she set it on a flat stone at the edge of his work, and stepped back and made a small motion with her hand. Eat. And Elias Crane looked at that loaf of bread the way another man might look at a gold piece lying in the road. Because he had not had bread baked by a human hand for him in 11 years of bunkhouses and trail camps and cold biscuit eaten alone. He broke it and gave half back to her, and they sat on 2 stones on opposite banks of the clear creek and ate bread together in the morning light. And Gray lay between them with his torn ear, and no one said anything, because nothing needed saying. I want to slow down here, because this is the true beginning of the thing, and the fast tellers of stories would rush past it to get to the trouble. But you and I are not in a hurry. We have a whole quiet hour, you and I mean to spend it well. Over the weeks that followed, without either of them naming it or deciding it, a rhythm grew up between the ranch on the ridge and the small house below. She would come up in the early morning 2 or 3 times a week, and she would bring bread or eggs or a jar of something put by, and he would have set aside for her whatever the land gave that he could spare. The first of the garden he had put in behind the house, a brace of trout out of the clear creek, once a length of good leather he had traded for and cut down to mend the harness she used on her old plow horse, because he had noticed, the way he noticed everything, that her harness was failing, and that she was too proud and too poor to say so. They learned each other slowly. He learned that if he wanted to tell her a thing, he had to face her full on and speak plain and slow, and that she read his mouth and his hands and his whole body, and got more of his meaning than most hearing people ever bothered to get. She learned that this scarred, silent man was patient, in a way she had almost stopped believing men could be, that he never once raised his hands in that big, exaggerated way people did with her, as if she were simple as well as death, that he waited for her, that he watched her hands when she signed even though he did not know the signs, watched them with a grave attention, as if he were determined to learn her whole language one gesture at a time. And he was. That is exactly what he was doing. It started with the ordinary things, the way it must. She would sign the word for water and point to the creek, and he would watch her hand and then try it, clumsy, his big scarred fingers making the shape wrong, and she would reach out and correct them, moving his fingers with her own, patient as he was patient. And he would do it again until it was right. And then that word was theirs. Water, bread, dog, morning, cold. Then harder ones. Thank you, which she already knew from that first day. Good, which she made by touching her chin and moving her flat hand down, and which she gave him one morning after he had mended a gate hinge on her place without being asked, gave it to him with a small smile. And he carried that one word around for a whole day like a coal in his chest. Do you see how a language is a kind of intimacy? Most people who can hear never think about it. They spend their words like water from a tap, careless, endless. But when every single word must be built by hand, learned, corrected, given and received on purpose, then every word is a gift, and a conversation is a thing two people make together the way you would raise a wall together. And there is no lying in it, because the whole body is in it, and the eyes cannot look away. By the turning of the season, Elias Crane could sign perhaps 40 words, clumsy and slow, his big scarred hands making shapes they were never built for. And the first full sentence he ever signs to her, standing in her dooryard one evening with the harvest light going long and gold across the valley, was this: "Your water is safe." He had worked it out over many days. Your water is safe. And Nora Vale stood in her own dooryard and watched this man she was not supposed to want, this man the whole valley pitied and scorned, shape those 4 words with hands that had split and bled to give her clear water. And something in her that had been closed since her husband's grave 2 winters back came quietly, painfully, gratefully open. But not everything opened easily, and I would be lying to you if I told you the road ran smooth from there, because it did not. And the reason it did not was that other people had opinions, and in a small place other people's opinions have teeth. I should tell you now about the man whose opinion had the sharpest teeth of all, because he is the cold wind that blows through the whole middle of this tale, and it is time you met him proper.
Harlan Voss owned the bank, or most of it, and the freight line, and the biggest spread in the valley, 12,000 acres of good grass running south from town, and he owned, in the way that a certain kind of man comes to own the people around him, a good portion of Cedar Hollow itself. He was not loud. That is the thing you must understand about men like Voss. The dangerous ones are never loud. He was courteous. He wore a clean collar, and he tipped his hat to the churchwomen, and he lent money to farmers in hard years at rates that sounded like mercy right up until the year the crop failed, and the mercy turned out to be a hook with a very long line on it. He smiled easily. He remembered your children's names, and behind the smile his mind was always working the same single sum, which was, what is this worth to me, and how do I come to hold it? And Harlan Voss wanted water. The valley was dry country, good grass, but dry, and the whole of it lived or died on the creeks that came down out of the mountains, and the best and steadiest of those creeks was the one that ran along the eastern edge of the cursed Halloran place, and down through Nora Vale's 10 acres to the dozen small ranches below. In a wet year, it hardly mattered, but Voss could read a sky as well as any man, and he knew the wet years were ending, and he had for some time intended to own that water, and through it to own the smaller ranches downstream who depended on it,
and did not yet know how much they were about to depend on it. 3 men had failed on the upper land, and Voss had been patient, buying up their debts, letting the place rot, waiting for the parcel to fall quietly into his hand like ripe fruit. And now, some scarred nobody had walked in and bought it out from under him for $11 and a bad name. And worse, had made the dead creek run clear. And worse than that, had befriended the deaf widow who held the lower headgate, the old iron diversion that could send that clear, cold water either down the valley to the little ranches or over into the dry coulee that ran on to Voss land. Whoever held Nora's 10 acres held the key to the whole system. Voss had offered to buy it 3 times. She had said no 3 times, plain and final. And Voss had filed that refusal away in the cold ledger of his mind the way he filed everything, under the heading of things that will fall to me eventually, because everything does. Voss did not like surprises. But he was a patient man, and when they first told him about the scarred drifter, he only smiled and said, "Give him a season. That ground breaks everyone. It will break him too, and I will buy it off the bank when it does, same as always." He was wrong, of course, but it would take him a long and expensive time to find out how wrong, and a great many things would happen first. Word got around, the way word does. The scarred man and the deaf widow. They were seen. A woman going up to a lone man's place in the early mornings. Cedar Hollow's church porch philosophers made of that exactly what small minds make of everything. And the talk turned ugly the way talk does. And it reached Nora. Because talk always reaches the person it is about, deaf or not, through the shapes of mouths in the general store, and the way the women's hands went still when she came in. And it reached Elias, in the flat, cruel form of a man he had never met, leaning off a horse outside the feed store to say, loud enough for the street, "You keep your ruined face away from decent women, mister. You hear me? Folks are talking." Elias Crane looked at that man a long moment, with the burned side of his face still and unreadable. And then he said, very quiet, in the voice he used when he was angriest, "She is more decent than this whole street, and you have never once said good morning to her. Now step your horse back. You are standing in my way." And he walked on. He did not raise his voice. Remember that about him. The angrier he got, the quieter. It is the decent ones who go quiet. The loud ones are just afraid. That night he sat by his fire with Gray and turned the thing over in his mind, the way he turned everything over, slow, from all sides. He was not a fool. He knew what the talk could do to her. A woman alone, a woman who had to live in that valley and buy her flour in that store and be, whether she liked it or not, at the mercy of what that street decided she was. His coming up the ridge and taking her water in hand had been meant to help her. He saw now that his mere nearness might harm her, that a man with a name and a face like his was a dangerous thing to be linked to, and the old cold voice in him, the voice 11 years of bunkhouses had trained, said clearly, "Leave her be, then. Keep to your ground. Want nothing. You know better than to want." He had lived by that voice a long time. It had kept him safe the way a locked door keeps a house safe, and just as empty. But there was the bread. There was her hand flat on her chest and moving out toward him, open. There was the way she had read his work at the creek and not his face. There was, God help him, the way the whole gray world went a little warmer and a little more colored the 2 or 3 mornings a week he knew she might come up the path. And Elias Crane, 41 years old and scarred inside worse than out, sat by his fire that night
and did a thing he had not let himself do in 11 years. He let himself want something. He did not do anything about it, not yet. That was not his way. But he let himself feel it, and he did not slam the door on it. And that, for a man like Elias Crane, was the bravest thing he had done in years, braver than moving the whole creek. Now, before we go on into the harder part of the story, I want to pause and speak to you plain for a moment, the way I do, because I have been thinking about you as I tell this. I do not know your city yet, unless you have told me, and if you have, thank you, truly. It means something to me to know where you are sitting. But wherever you are, I would guess that you know something about that locked door voice, the one that tells you it is safer not to want, safer not to hope, safer to keep your face turned away and expect little so that little cannot hurt you. Most people who have lived a while and lost a while know that voice. And I want you to notice, as we go, that the voice is not lying exactly. It really is safer. Elias Crane really would have been safer to keep his door locked. That is the terrible thing. The locked door does keep you safe. It just keeps you safe the way a coffin keeps you safe. And the whole question of a life, the only question that finally matters, is whether you will trade a little of that safety for the chance at something warm before the dark comes. Hold that. We are going to watch two people make that trade, and it is going to cost them. And I want you to decide for yourself by the end whether it was worth what it cost. Now, onward. The barn went up that late summer, and I want to tell you about the barn because it is where two of the finest people in this story walked into it. Elias built it alone at first, on the black square where the old one had burned, and there was something in him building a barn on burned ground, though he never said so, and I will not make more of it than he would. A man who carried fire on his face, raising up a new thing on the ashes of an old fire, straight and square and true. Either it holds, or it does not. He shaped the beams by hand and raised them alone with a block and tackle and a great deal of stubbornness. And it was slow, and it was going to be a near thing whether he got it closed in before the weather turned. And that is when the first of them came. His name was Tom Aldous, 15 years old, all elbows and appetite, the youngest of a downstream family that had nearly lost their place in the dry years and had come clear-eyed to understand that the water running full again had something to do with the scarred man on the ridge. Tom came up one morning and stood at the edge of the yard and said, blunt as boys are, "My pa says the water is your doing, says I am to help you and not take pay for it on account of what it saved us." And Elias, who could have used the help and had never once in his life been offered anything free, looked at the boy a long moment and said, "Your pa is a good man. Grab that end." Tom started skeptical, the way the young start everything, sneaking looks at the burned face when he thought Elias was not watching, and once, early, asking outright with a boy's cruelty that is not really cruelty, just a boy not knowing yet what a face costs. "Does it hurt? Your face?" And Elias, setting a peg, not looking up, said only, "Not anymore." And the boy, hearing something in that "not anymore" that he was too young to name, but not too young to feel, went quiet and did not ask again. And something shifted between them, because Elias had answered him like a man answering a man, and not like a freak answering a gawker. And a boy remembers being treated like a man. You cannot work beside a man like Elias Crane for a month and stay skeptical. You watch how he sets a post. You watch how he never wastes a motion or a word, how he fixes a thing right the first time so it never needs fixing again, how he treats the mule and the dog and the boy himself with the same grave courtesy he would give a governor. And somewhere in that month, the boy stopped seeing the scar at all, the way you stop seeing it, and started seeing the man. And by the end of the summer, Tom Aldous would have walked into a fire for Elias Crane, which is a phrase I use on purpose and will come back to. The second one who came was the old man. His name was Asa Pike, and he had been the blacksmith in Cedar Hollow for 40 years before his hands gave out. And he was the one man in that valley who had never once cared what a face looked like, having seen every kind of man come through his shop, and having formed the settled opinion that 90 of every 100 were fools, regardless of their looks. Asa had watched the new man from town, sharp old eyes missing nothing. And one day he closed up what was left of his shop and rode up the ridge and got down and walked all around that new barn without a word, testing a joint here, sighting down a beam there. And at the end of it, he stood in front of Elias, and he looked at the work, and he said one word. Huh. From Asa Pike, that one word was a coronation. It meant, this man knows what he is doing, and there are not 3 others in this county I would say that of. Elias understood it exactly. He said, coffee is on. And that was the beginning of the second friendship, the crusty old man and the scarred younger one. And many an evening after that, you would have found the 2 of them on the porch of the mended house with gray between them, saying almost nothing, watching the light go down the valley. 2 men who had learned the hard way that the finest company is the kind that lets you be quiet. It was Asa, one of those evenings, who first spoke to Elias about the widow. And it was Asa who first told the thing that changed everything, though it would take a while to land. They were sitting in the dusk, and a light showed down the ridge in the window of the small house, and Asa nodded at it with his chin and said, "You know, she reads lips better than any soul I ever met." Elias said he had gathered that. Asa was quiet a while, and then he said, not looking over, in the offhand way old men say the things that matter most, "My wife was deaf. Ellen. 40 years I had with her. Whole town thought I married her out of pity, or thought I could not do better with this ugly trade and these burned-up hands." He held up the old, scarred blacksmith's hands and looked at them in the last light. "They had it exactly backwards, son. They always do. Never you mind what a town thinks it sees." And he would not say any more that night, but he had planted it, and it would grow. So there it was. By the deep of that first autumn, Elias Crane, who had ridden in with $11 and a bad name and no friend in the world but a stray dog, had a mended house and a new barn and clear water and a boy who worshipped him and an old man who approved of him and a woman down the ridge who brought him bread and read his hands. He had, though he could hardly make himself believe it, the beginnings of a life. Let me show you one more thing before the cold wind comes, because I want you to see, with your own eyes, as it were, the kind of man this was, so that when the town later calls him a schemer, you will know in your bones how false that was. There came, that first autumn, a storm out of the north, early and hard, the kind of storm that country got maybe once a decade, a wall of snow and wind that dropped the temperature 40 degrees between noon and dark and caught the whole valley unready. And down below, on the Aldous place, Tom's family had a milk cow calving in the worst of it, and their old barn roof gave way under the wet weight of the snow. And there was Tom's father, alone, with a downed cow and a half-born calf and a barn coming down around him. And it was Tom who came up the ridge through the blizzard on foot, because the horse would not face it, half frozen, to bang on Elias Crane's door. Now, a sensible man does not go out into a storm like that. A sensible man says it is a shame about the cow and stays by his fire. But Elias Crane put on every stitch he owned and lit a lantern and took a coil of rope and a length of canvas and went down off that ridge into the teeth of it with the boy. And Gray went too. And I will not pretend it was not a near thing, because it was. A man can die in country like that, between his own barn and his own house. But Elias knew snow the way he knew water, knew how to read a whiteout, knew to keep the wind on the same cheek the whole way down so he would not walk in a circle and freeze. And they came to the Aldous place, and Elias Crane spent that whole black, howling night doing 3 things at once: propping the fallen roof with poles and rope and his own back, turning the calf inside the cow with hands that knew how, because he had done it 100 times on other men's ranches, and keeping a boy and his exhausted father from doing anything foolish. And by the gray dawn, there was a live calf and a live cow, and a patched roof, and 4 people and a dog alive by a rebuilt fire. And Elias Crane drank 1 cup of coffee, and then walked back up the ridge in the clearing cold to see to his own stock. Because that is what you do. And he never once mentioned it to a soul, never asked a thing for it. And if you had asked him about it, he would have said only that a man does not let a neighbor lose a cow, which was the whole of his creed folded into a single, flat sentence. The Aldous family did not forget that night. You do not forget the man who walks into a blizzard for your cow. That is a debt written in a place deeper than any bank keeps its books. And it is going to matter later on the courthouse steps. So hold it. And there was the horse, too, which I will tell you quickly because it shows the other side of the same man, the gentleness under the iron. There was a downstream rancher named Coombs, with a good young gelding that some fool had ruined with a whip before he ever saddled it, made it head-shy and mean and useless, and Coombs was going to shoot it, and Elias Crane, who had watched the horse from the road, said, "Give it to me instead." And Coombs, glad to be shut of it, did. And what Elias did with that horse over the following weeks, no one saw much of, because he did it alone and quiet in the corral he had rebuilt. But it was the same thing he did with everything: water and land, and boy and dog and woman. He was patient with it. He asked nothing of it he had not first earned the right to ask. He stood in that corral hour after hour, doing nothing, just being a calm, still thing in the horse's world, until the horse decided, on its own, in its own time, that this man was not the whip, that this man's hands did not lie. And one morning Tom came up and found Elias riding that ruined gelding around the corral, quiet as a Sunday. And the boy said, "How did you do that?" And Elias said, "I did not do anything. I just let it find out I was not going to hurt it. Takes as long as it takes. Takes as long as it takes." That was how he gentled the horse. And if you have been paying attention, you already know it is exactly how he gentled the deaf widow's frightened heart, and exactly how, though he did not know it yet, she was gentling his. The two of them standing still in each other's world long enough to find out that the hands did not lie. There was a scene at the store, too, that autumn, that I have to give you, because it is where you see for the first time what the town was, and what she had endured in it. Nora needed flour and thread, and Elias, who had business at the feed store, walked in with her, which set the tongues going before the door had shut. And Elias watched, for the first time up close, how the town treated her, watched the storekeeper speak to her too loud and too slow, and then turn to Elias to ask what she wanted, as if she were a child or a horse, and watched the church women's hands go still and their eyes go sideways, and watched Nora stand through all of it with her chin up and her face still, absorbing it the way she had absorbed it 1,000 times. And something in Elias Crane, who had spent his own life absorbing exactly that kind of treatment for the sin of his face, went very quiet and very hot at once. He did not make a scene. He never made a scene. But when the storekeeper turned to him and said, loud, slow, "What does she want, mister?" Elias Crane looked at the man a long moment, and then said, quiet, "Ask her. She is standing right there, and she can read your mouth better than you can read that ledger. You just have to look at her when you talk, like she is a person, which she is, and which you have known her to be for the 10 years she has bought flour off you." And the store went silent, and the storekeeper went red, and he turned to Nora, and for the first time in that man's memory, he looked at her, actually looked at her, and said, slower, but this time to her face, "What did she need?" And Nora Vale looked back at him level, and told him with her hands, while Elias put the words to it. And a small thing changed in that store that day. A very small thing. One man learning to look at one woman like a person. But small things are how the world actually turns. And Nora walked out of that store having been, for the first time in a decade, addressed. And she did not say anything to Elias about it. But on the walk home, she reached over once and touched the back of his scarred hand with 2 fingers, light, and then took her hand back. And that was everything. I linger on these because I want you to understand that the love in this story was not built out of grand gestures. It was built out of exactly this. A man walking into a blizzard, a man saying, "Ask her," a man standing still in a corral until a frightened thing chose to trust him. Love is not a feeling that arrives. It is a thing 2 people build out of 10,000 small honesties, and either it holds or it does not, and theirs was built to hold. And that, of course, is exactly when Harlan Voss made his first move. Because men like Voss cannot bear to see the discarded build something, and the whole engine of this kind of story is that the world will always send a cold wind against the first warm thing a lonely person dares to grow. It came, as such things do, wearing a friendly hat. A man rode up the ridge one afternoon, well-dressed, easy in the saddle, and introduced himself as Mr. Calder, a land agent, he said, representing certain interests. And he sat his horse in Elias Crane's dooryard and looked around at all the work with a smile that never reached his eyes, and said what a fine job, what a truly fine job the new owner had done. Why, he would hardly recognize the old Halloran place. And it seemed a shame, a real shame, that such fine work should sit on ground with such a clouded title. Elias, who had been splitting rails, set down his maul and said, "Title is clean. I've got the bill of sale and the county filing." And Mr. Calder smiled wider, and said that of course he had, of course, but titles were funny things. And there was some question, it seemed, about whether old Halloran had truly held clear title to convey, given certain debts that certain parties had certain claims on. And it would be a terrible thing, would it not, for a man to pour his whole self into a place and then find the ground pulled out from under him on a technicality. And here was the friendly part. Here was the hat. Certain parties were prepared to be generous, to buy the place outright at a fair price, more than fair, and save Mr. Crane all that trouble and uncertainty. Cash, this week. Elias Crane picked his maul back up. He looked at the land agent with the still burned side of his face, and he said, quiet, "You tell your certain parties that the title is clean, the water is mine, and the place is not for sale. Not this week, not ever. Now you are on my ground, and I have got rails to split." And he swung them all, and the rail split clean. And when he looked up, the land agent was already turning his horse, still smiling. Because men like that always smile. And as he rode off, he said over his shoulder, pleasant as sunshine, "Think it over, Mr. Crane. Titles are such uncertain things. And a man in your position, well, it would be a shame to be alone when the trouble comes." A man in your position. Elias stood in his dooryard and heard the whole threat folded up inside those 5 soft words. And he understood that the cold wind had found him at last, as he had always known it would, and that the question now was not whether the trouble would come, but only how much of it, and whether this time, for the first time in his life, he had anything worth standing to lose. He looked down the ridge toward the small house, where a slight woman was hanging wash in the long light. And he had his answer, and it frightened him more than any land agent ever could. That night, for the first time, he did a thing he had never done, which was to tell someone. He went down the ridge in the dusk, which he had never done, and he stood at a proper distance in her dooryard until she came out, and by the light of her lamp, slow, with his 40 clumsy words and a good deal of pointing, he made her understand. A man came. About the water, about the land. Trouble is coming. And Nora Vale stood in her doorway and read it off his hands and his face. And she did not look frightened, which surprised him. She looked, if anything, grimly unsurprised, the look of a woman who has been fighting a quiet war for 2 years and has just learned the name of the general on the other side. She signed one word, and he knew it, because it was a name everyone in the valley knew, made by drawing a V in the air and then the sign for money. Voss. And then she made a small, hard motion, cutting flat with her hand, that he did not need any language to read. Not this time. Not us. And that was the night, though neither of them said it, that they stopped being 2 lonely people who shared water, and became allies in a war. Now here's where I want to stop and speak to you directly again, friend, because we have come to the hinge of the thing, and you should catch your breath before we go down into the hard middle of it. I asked you at the start what town you are listening from. Now I want to ask you something a little different, and you can answer it in the comments too, or you can just answer it in your own heart, which is where the real answering always happens. I want to know what country you are listening from tonight, and I want to know whether there has ever been a Harlan Voss in your life, a smooth and patient and respectable person who wanted something you had and set about taking it with a smile, wearing a friendly hat, never once raising their voice. Because I think most of us have known one, and I think most of us have felt, at least once, the particular helplessness of being the small one in that fight, of knowing you are in the right, and knowing that being in the right may not be enough, because the other side holds the money and the law and the good opinion of the town. Elias Crane and Nora Vale were about to feel that helplessness all the way to the bottom. But I promised you light on the other side, and I keep my promises. So stay with me, and let us go down into the hard part together. The trouble came the way Voss did everything, patient and layered and wearing respectable clothes. First there was a notice, an official-looking paper, delivered to Elias by the county clerk with an apologetic face, stating that a claim had been filed against the title of the former Halloran parcel by the estate of a creditor, and that a hearing would be held in 90 days to determine the rightful ownership, and that until then the property was under a cloud and could not be sold, improved with a loan against it, or defended by any easy means. It was all perfectly legal. That was the horror of it. Harlan Voss never once did anything that was not perfectly legal. He had simply purchased, quietly, over years, the old dead debts of the men who had failed on that ground,
and now he unrolled them like a snake unrolling, one slow coil at a time. Then there was the money. Elias had little put by from the sale of his first small trout and timber surplus, and he had meant to buy cattle with it, a starter herd, the thing that would finally make the ranch pay. But the only cattle for sale that season were Voss cattle, or cattle from men who owed Voss and would not cross him. And every time Elias inquired, the price came back just a little too high, or the deal fell through at the last moment with an apologetic shrug. And slowly it dawned on him that the whole valley economy was a single web, and Harlan Voss sat at the center of it, and that a man could be strangled without a single hand ever being laid on him. He found his cattle, in the end, 6 head, by riding 2 days over the pass to a valley where Voss's web did not reach, and paying too much, and driving them back himself over hard country. And that 6 head was very nearly everything he had in the world turned into hoof and horn, his whole season's hope walking on 4 legs. Then there was the talk, and this was the worst, because it touched her. Voss's questions, asked in the right ears, had done their quiet work all season, and now the talk about the scarred man and the deaf widow had curdled from mere scandal into something with a purpose behind it. The new story, the one that spread from the church porch and the store counter, was that Elias Crane was a scheming drifter who had come to the valley to prey on a helpless deaf woman, to worm his way into her affection and her property, to get his ruined hands on the one valuable thing she owned, her water rights, her head gate, her 10 acres. That was the story. That the whole thing, the bread and the mended harness and the signs he had learned, was a long, cruel confidence game. And here is the cruelty inside the cruelty. The very kindness that should have proved his goodness was turned, by Voss's quiet art, into the proof of his villainy. He learned her language? A schemer's trick. He fixed her water? Softening her up. He asked nothing of her? The patient long game of a man after something bigger. There's no defense against that kind of talk, do you see? Every good thing you do becomes evidence against you. It is the oldest and dirtiest weapon there is, and small towns wield it without even knowing they have been aimed. It reached Nora, of course. It reached her through the store, through the frozen hands and the sliding eyes, through a churchwoman who cornered her by the flour barrels and, speaking with that awful, slow loudness people used on her, mouthed the words so Nora could not fail to read them. He is using you, dear. Everyone knows it. He wants your land. A man like that could never truly want a woman like you. A woman like you. Nora Vale stood very still by the flour barrels, the way she had learned to stand still all her silent life, and she read those words off that kind, cruel mouth, and she felt the old wound she had carried since she was 6 years old open right up, the wound that said, "You are less. You are pity. You are the sad thing people are glad they are not. No whole man will ever choose you, only use you." It was the deepest wound she had, deeper than her widowhood, deeper than her silence, and Harlan Voss's poison had found it as surely as if he had drawn a map. And here is the terrible thing that the poison did, the thing Voss counted on. It did not make her doubt Elias, not exactly. It made her doubt herself, because she had let herself hope over that long, sweet autumn. She had let herself begin to believe that this man saw her, chose her, wanted her, and the poison whispered that this was exactly the vanity a foolish, lonely widow would fall for, that of course she wanted to believe a good man had come for her, and not for her water. Of course, that is what a desperate woman always tells herself right up until the day she signs the paper, and he takes the land and is gone. And Nora Vale, who was nobody's fool, who had survived 2 years alone by trusting nothing she could not verify, turned that cold, verifying eye on her own heart and could not, in that poisoned hour, be sure. So she did what the wounded do. She protected herself. She left her flower on the counter and walked home the 2 miles in the failing light, and she did not come up the ridge the next morning, or the morning after, or the morning after that. And Elias Crane, splitting rails alone in his dooryard, watching the path she did not come up, understood that the cold wind had reached the one warm thing he had, exactly as he had feared, and that the poison had done its work, and that she had believed it, or half believed it, or feared it might be true, which for a wound that old is the same as believing. The old locked door voice in him rose up and said, "See? You knew better. You always knew better than to want. Now close the door and tend your ground, and let her go. It is kinder. You are poison to her. Everything that touches you burns." And for 3 days Elias Crane listened to that voice, because it was an old friend, and it had kept him safe a long time. And he did not go down the ridge. He worked, instead, harder than he needed to, the way men do, splitting more rails than any fence would ever need, as if a man could split the wanting out of himself if he only split enough wood. Gray watched him from the porch and would not come down into the yard, because even the dog knew something was wrong with the man, and that is a lonely thing, to be avoided by your own dog. It was Asa Pike who broke it. The old blacksmith came up on the 4th evening and found Elias on the porch not doing anything, which for Elias was the loudest possible sign of grief, and Asa sat down in the other chair with a grunt and let the silence run a while the way they did. And then he said, looking out at the valley and not at Elias, "I told you my Ellen was deaf." Elias said nothing. Asa went on, "Deaf as a post since she was a girl. Whole town thought I was a fool to marry her, thought I took pity, or thought I could not do better. 40 years I had with that woman, 40 years, and I never once had to hear a word to know exactly what she thought of me, because she showed me every single day, with her hands and her eyes and her bread, which is more than most hearing wives ever bothered to show their men." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "The town has got it backwards, son. It always does. It is not that a man like you settles for a woman like her. It is that a woman who has spent her whole life being looked past is the one soul in this valley who will actually see you, scar and all, and never once flinch. You had that. I watched it grow all autumn. And now you are sitting up here on this porch letting Harlan Voss and a pack of gossiping fools throw it away for you." Elias Crane sat in the dark a long time after that, and then he said, "She thinks I am after the land." And Asa said, "Then you have got exactly one job, and it is to make her know different, and you will not do it sitting on this porch." And Elias said, "How does a man make somebody know a thing like that?" And the old man was quiet, and then he said the truest thing anybody said in this whole story. He said, "You cannot say it to her. Saying is cheap, and she knows it is cheap. She has heard cheap saying her whole life without hearing a word of it. You have got to show her the thing you would never show a soul that was after your land. You have got to show her the part of you that you keep hid. That is the only proof there is." And then Asa stood up and said, "Huh," and went home, and left Elias Crane to understand what he had meant. The next morning, early in the gray light, Elias Crane walked down the ridge to the small house for the first time, instead of waiting for her to come up. He had never gone to her. Something in him had always felt he had no right to, that he could receive her gifts and give his own in return across the neutral ground of the creek, but that he must never presume to come down and stand at her door, a scarred man at a lone woman's door. But he went now, because Asa was right, and the door in him had been standing open all autumn, whether he admitted it or not. And a man does not leave the one warm thing he has to freeze because he is afraid. She saw him coming through the window. He watched her see him. He watched her go still. And he stopped in the middle of her dooryard, out where it was proper, and he waited, hat in his hands, until she came to the door and opened it, and stood there with her chin up and her eyes wary and hurt, the eyes of a woman braced to be told one more time what she was worth. And Elias Crane, who had 40 clumsy signs and a lifetime of things he had never said to anyone, faced her full on in the gray light and began, slowly, with his big, scarred hands, to say the truest thing he had ever said. He signed, they say. He touched his own chest, over the heart. He signed, your land. He shook his head, slow and certain. And then, because 40 signs were not enough and would never be enough, he did the thing Asa had told him to do, the thing he had never done in front of another living soul. He handed her the part he kept hid. He turned the burned side of his face full into the morning light, square to her, and he made no attempt to hide it or angle it away. This thing he had spent 11 years hiding. And then, slower still, he began to tell her, with his hands and his broken words and his unhidden face, the thing he had never told anyone, the story of the fire. I will tell it to you the way he told it to her, because you have earned it by staying this long, and because a man's deepest wound, once he shows it, is a kind of gift, and it should be received with care. There had been, 11 years before, a woman, and a small house, and a life just barely begun, a young man's whole future folded up small and precious the way a first love folds it. And there had been a fire in the night, a lamp, a wind, an old dry house going up faster than a thing has any right to go. And Elias Crane had gone back into it once and gotten her out, and gone back into it again for the reason a young man goes back into a burning house, because he could not imagine the world without what was in it. And the roof had come down. He had lived. She had not. And he had come out of that fire with half his face gone, and the whole of his future gone with it. And he had learned, lying in the long dark of the healing, the lesson that had ruled him for 11 years, which was that to love a thing is to stand in the doorway of a house that can burn, and that a wise man does not stand in that doorway. A wise man keeps to the open ground where nothing can fall on him, wanting nothing, so that nothing can be taken. That is why he drifted. That is why he built other men's houses and never his own. That is why he had a locked door voice in him and a face he kept turned away. Not vanity, grief. The scar on the outside was the small wound. The scar on the inside was the one that had ruled him. And he had never told a living soul, because a man does not show the world the doorway of his burned house. But he showed it to her, standing in her dooryard in the gray light, with his ruined face turned full to the sun and no defense left at all. He showed Nora Vale the whole of it, the fire and the woman, and the 11 years of locked doors. And then he signed, clumsy and sure, the 4 words he had built for this. And they were not, I love you,
because he did not yet have the sign, and because it was not quite the thing he needed to say. He signed, "I am not hiding." And then he laid his open hand flat over his own heart, the way she had laid hers that first day at the creek, and held it there, and looked at her, and let her read on his unhidden face the thing his 40 signs could not carry. Not your land. You. And I will stand in the doorway. For you, I will stand in the doorway of the burning house. Nora Vale stood in her doorway and read that scarred, unhidden, wholly exposed face. The face of a man who had just handed her the one thing he had spent his whole life protecting, which was not his heart exactly. It was his shame, his hidden, ruined self, and the reason for it, offered up in the plain light with no defense at all. And she understood, all at once and all the way down, that a schemer does not do that. A user does not stand in the cold, gray light and turn his worst wound to the sun and make himself that naked and that easy to destroy. Only a man who means it does that. Only a man who has decided you are worth the risk of his whole guarded self. And the old wound in her, the "you are less," the "no whole man will ever choose you," the "a man like that could never truly want a woman like you." It did not close. Wounds that old do not close. But it was, for the first time in 25 years, answered. She came down off the step. She crossed the dooryard to him, slight and straight-backed, and no longer wary. And she reached up with both her hands. And this woman who had spent her life watching people flinch from a face, laid her 2 hands flat against the burned side of Elias Crane's face. Gently, deliberately, the way you would lay your hands on something precious. And she held them there, warm against the ruined skin. And she looked into his pulled-down eye without a flicker or a flinch. And then she leaned in and laid her forehead against his forehead. And the two of them stood like that in the gray morning, breathing the same air, saying nothing. Because between the two of them, nothing had ever needed to be said. Gray came down off the porch then, at last, and sat in the dooryard and watched them, and thumped his tail once against the ground, which was, from the dog, the same as Ace's, the same coronation. Animals know. I told you it would matter. So that was the choosing, or the first half of it, the private half, the half no crowd ever saw. 2 wounded people standing forehead to forehead in a gray dooryard choosing each other against a whole valley that had decided they were a scandal and a scheme. And I want to linger here a moment, in the good part, before the trouble sharpens again. Because the fast tellers rush past the good parts, and I will not. Because you and I both know that the good parts are what a life is actually for, and that they are always shorter than the trouble, and that this is exactly why you must not rush past them when they come. There followed a stretch of days, a few weeks only, into the first hard edge of winter, that were the sweetest either of them had known in years. She came up the ridge openly now, not caring who saw, and he went down to her. And in the evenings the two of them and the boy and the old man would sometimes all be in the mended house together, a fire going. And the strangest thing happened in that house, which was that it filled up with a kind of conversation the valley would never have understood. A conversation of hands and faces and firelight. Nora teaching them all her language and laughing silently, her whole face laughing, when Ace's stiff old blacksmith hands mangled a sign, and Tom, quick as boys are,
getting fluent faster than any of them, and Elias watching all of it from the corner, with a look on the good side of his face that Asa had never seen there, and privately thanked God for. They learned her name for the ranch, which she made with a sign that meant more or less the high, clear water. They learned each other's small jokes, and there grew up between Elias and Nora a private shorthand, a thing that happens between two people who love each other in any language, a single exchange that became theirs. He would sign, "Are you cold?" because he was always, in his practical way, worried about whether she was warm and fed and dry, the ways a man like him knows how to love.
And she would sign back, "Not anymore," which had started as an answer about the fire he would build, and became, without either of them deciding it, an answer about something much larger. So that, "Are you cold? Not anymore," came to mean, between the two of them, the whole thing, the loneliness and the end of it. And they said it to each other in front of people who had no idea they were saying, "I love you," right out in the open. That is a real thing, friend. If you have ever loved somebody a long time, you have a phrase like that. A nothing phrase that means everything, and nobody outside the two of you knows what it carries. Hold on to that, too. It was in one of those warm evenings, the fire low and the boy gone home, and the old man dozing in his chair, that Nora told Elias the whole of her own story, the way he had told her the fire. Because that is what people do once they have decided to trust each other. They trade their wounds. They hand them across the way she had handed thank you across the creek. She told it with her hands, slow, and he read it. "And I will give it to you the way she gave it to him." She had been born hearing, she signed, a hearing child in a hearing family. And she had a memory, just one, thin as a worn coin, of sound, her mother singing. And she did not know any more if it was a real memory or one she had built to have something. The fever came when she was 6 and took the sound and left her alive. And her family, plain, hard people, did not know what to do with a deaf child. And so they did what such families did. They decided she was simple, because a child who does not answer must be simple. And they stopped trying to reach her. And she grew up in a house full of talking she could not touch, watching mouths move around a table, and never once being handed a single word. More alone in a full house than she would ever be alone on 10 acres. She signed to Elias in the firelight, "Do you know what it is to be in a room full of your own family and be more alone than a stone?" And Elias Crane, who did know, who had spent 11 years in bunkhouses full of men, being one more back turned to him, nodded and did not look away. And she went on. And then, she signed, there was Samuel, a plain farmer, older, quiet, who had come to her father's place to buy a horse and had seen the deaf daughter set apart in the corner and had, alone of everyone, walked over to her and made the effort, clumsy and slow, to reach her, pointing, gesturing, and then over months of coming back, learning, actually learning, the finger shapes from a book he had sent away for, until one day this plain older farmer had handed her, in her own language, the first full sentence anyone had given her in 14 years. And the sentence was, "Will you come away from here and let me build you a house where you are not alone?" And she had gone. Of course she had gone. And she had 6 good years, 6 years of being spoken to, being a full soul in her own home. And then the fever came a second time, the same fever, and took Samuel and left her alive again. And she had stood at his grave, and understood that she had been given a miracle, and that miracles do not come twice, and that she would live out her days back inside the silence she had briefly, gloriously escaped. And she signed, looking at the fire and not at Elias. I told myself I would never let myself want that again, being spoken to, because losing it the first time nearly killed me, and I did not think I would live through losing it twice.
And then she signed, and here she looked up at him, at the ruined, unhidden face lit gold by the fire. And then you came up the creek and put your bleeding hands in the dirt to bring me clear water. And then you learned my language, one word at a time. And I have been so afraid, because it is happening again, the wanting, and I do not know if I am strong enough to have it and lose it a second time. And Elias Crane sat in the firelight and read that off her hands, the deepest and most frightened thing she had, handed across to him the way he had handed her the fire. And he understood that they were the same, the two of them, both of them people who had loved and lost and built the locked door out of the losing. And he did the only thing there was to do, which was not to promise he would never die, because a good man does not lie even to comfort, but to take her hands and still them, and then sign, slow and sure, the truest answer there is. I cannot promise you forever. Nobody can. But I can promise you, I will not waste a day of whatever we get. And that, friend, is the only honest promise any two people who love each other can ever really make. And it is enough. It has always been enough. It is the whole of it. She wept then, a little, silent as everything about her was silent. And he held her, and Gray sighed in his sleep, and the old man dozed on, and the fire burned down. And if you have ever sat with someone, and finally, after years of the locked door, let yourself be held, you know that it is not a small thing. It is the largest thing there is, and it does not make a sound. I want to tell you also, because I promised you the whole of it, that Voss did not stop pressing during those sweet weeks, that even while they were building their warm evenings, the cold wind kept blowing under the door. There was the bank, which called in a small note that Elias had signed for lumber, called it early on a technicality, hoping to catch him short, and Elias paid it barely, selling his good saddle to do it and riding a borrowed one, and said nothing. There was the freight line, Voss's freight line, that suddenly could not or would not carry Elias's small surplus to the railhead at any price he could meet, so that a man who had crops and hides to sell found the only road to market quietly closed to him. And Elias hauled his goods 2 extra days over the pass himself, rather than beg Voss for the road, and said nothing. Piece by piece, the smiling, patient man tried to close every door in the valley against them. And piece by piece, the scarred man went around, or over, or through, at great cost and in silence. And what Voss did not understand, what men like Voss never understand, is that every closed door Elias Crane went around only made him harder to break, and made the watching valley slowly wonder why so much machinery was being turned against one quiet man who had never done a thing but mend a creek and marry, or mean to marry, a widow nobody else had wanted. I said mean to marry, and I owe you that scene, because it is the heart of everything the brief of this story was built to say. The moment of the free choosing, and I will not let the trouble swallow it. It happened on an evening near the end of those sweet weeks, before the cattle were cut loose, before the petition, when the two of them walked up together to the head of the clear channel, to the place where the water first came clean off the mountain, because it had become their place, the place where it had all started. And they stood there in the last gold light with the water running clear at their feet. And Elias Crane, who had rehearsed this the way he rehearsed everything, slow and careful and alone, turned to her and began to sign the most important thing he would ever say. He signed, "I have thought about this a long time." And he had. He signed, "I am not a young man. I have a face people cross the street to avoid. I have hard ground and a fight coming with a hard man, and I cannot promise you it will go our way." And then he stopped, and he made himself say the next part plain, because it was the part that mattered, the part that made it a gift and not a grab. He signed, and this is important, "You already have your own land, your own house, your own water, your own name. You do not need me for a single thing. You have kept yourself alive and proud on 10 acres for 2 years, and you could keep on doing it for 40 more without me. And I want you to know that I know that." Do you see what he was doing, friend? He was taking away every reason of need. He was making sure that whatever she answered, she would be answering out of want and not out of need, out of freedom and not out of fear. Because he had spent his whole life being wanted by no one and needed by employers. And he understood, better than most people ever will, the whole difference between being needed and being wanted. And he loved her far too much to let her come to him out of need. He wanted to be chosen, freely, or not at all. So he signed the last of it, slow, his big, scarred hands sure now, so there could be no mistaking it. "I am not asking because you need me. You do not. I am asking because I want to spend whatever days I have left in a house with you in it, talking to you with these clumsy hands until they cannot move anymore. And because when I am with you, the world has a color it does not have when I am not. And because you are the only person in my whole life who looked at my face before my land. And I would rather have 1 hard year on this ridge married to you than 40 easy ones anywhere else on this earth." And then he signed the question, the plainest one there is, "Will you have me?" And he did not sink to a knee or make a show of it. He just stood there in the gold light with his ruined face turned full to her and his whole guarded self laid open, and waited, the way he had waited for the horse, the way he had waited for the water, the way a man waits when he has decided the thing is worth whatever the answer costs. And Nora Vale looked at him a long moment, this woman who had been told her whole life what she was worth, who had been pitied and dismissed and nearly declared a thing to be managed, who had loved once and lost and locked the door and sworn never to open it again. And she did not answer right away, because a thing this large deserves a silence. And her silences had always said more than anyone else's speech. And then she lifted her hands, and she did not sign yes, not first. First, she signed the thing that told him she had understood exactly the gift he had given her, exactly what it meant that he had stripped away every reason of need. She signed, "You are the first person who ever asked me instead of deciding for me." And then she signed yes. And then, because yes was not enough for a moment that large, she signed their shorthand, the private thing. Are you cold? And he understood, and his own eyes stung, and he signed back, not anymore. And the two of them stood at the head of the clear water in the last light, and had, without a single sound, the truest conversation two people can have, the one where each of them tells the other, "I choose you," freely, out of want and not need. And there is no larger thing that can pass between two human souls. And it passed between these two in perfect silence, with the water running clear at their feet. And if there were any justice in how the world hands out its warm moments, that one would have been enough to last them. But the world is not just, and the cold wind was already rising, and they both knew it. And they chose each other anyway, which is the only way anyone ever really chooses anyone, knowing the wind is coming and reaching out your hand regardless. But you and I both know it could not stay in that warm house forever, because the cold wind was still blowing, and Harlan Voss still held the dead debts and the tame town and the 90-day clock ticking down toward a hearing that could take the ground out from under everything. And a man like Voss does not lose a valley he has spent years acquiring just because two lonely people found each other. If anything, it made him move faster, because the one thing Voss truly could not allow was for those two parcels to become one, for the man's mended ranch and the woman's headgate to join under a single name, which is exactly what a marriage would do. And Voss was a careful reader of people, and he could see, as clearly as Asa Pike had seen, which way this was going. So he stopped being patient. And that, in the end, was his mistake, because a patient antagonist is very hard to beat, but the moment you make a man like Voss move fast, you make him move sloppy, and a sloppy villain leaves marks, and marks can be read by anyone willing to look. But nobody was looking yet. That winter, in Cedar Hollow, everybody was looking at the scandal, and Harlan Voss was counting on exactly that. The cattle came first. One cold morning near the turn of the year, Tom Aldous came pounding up the ridge on his family's plow horse, white-faced, to tell Elias that in the night someone had cut the fence on the upper pasture. The good, tight fence Elias had built with his own hands, and driven off the 6 head of stock he had finally managed to buy. The small starter herd he had paid for by selling nearly everything he had, and scattered them, or worse, into the timber and the coolies. And when Elias rode the line, he found the cut fence, clean cuts, deliberate, and he found the tracks of shod horses, more than one man's work. And he found, snagged on the cut wire where no honest accident would have left it, a scrap of good store-bought cloth. The kind of cloth a working cowhand does not wear. The kind of cloth a man wears when he works for a man who can afford to dress his hands well. Elias Crane crouched by that cut wire a long time with the scrap of cloth in his scarred hand, and the anger in him went very quiet and very cold, the way it did. And he understood that this was a message, that Voss was done being subtle, that the 90-day clock and the poisoned talk had not worked fast enough, and now the man meant to simply break him, drive off his stock, ruin his season, bankrupt him before the hearing, so there would be nothing left to fight for. He did not ride to town shouting, "Remember who he was." He put the scrap of cloth in a tin box he kept, along with his bill of sale and his county filing and the official notice of the claim, and he began, quietly, to keep a record. Dates, tracks, names where he could learn them. He had been underestimated his whole life, and he had learned that the thing an underestimated man must do is exactly what no one expects him to do, which is to stay calm and gather proof
and wait for the powerful man to overreach. Because the powerful always overreach. They cannot help it. Contempt makes them careless. Nora helped him, and this is the part the town would never have believed, that the helpless, deaf widow was, in fact, the sharpest set of eyes in the valley, that she saw things hearing people missed because she had spent her life reading what mouths tried to hide, and that she began on her own 2 miles of road and in her own trips to the poisoned store to gather her own quiet record. She could not hear the men talking, but she could read their lips across a room, and she read off the careless mouths of Voss's own hands in the store, boasting to each other where they thought no one could hear a deaf woman anyway, exactly who had cut that fence, and on whose word.
Do you see the beautiful justice of it building? The 2 things the valley scorned them for, his ruined face that made him watchful, her deafness that made her a reader of silence, these were about to become the very tools that brought a powerful man down. That is not an accident of the story. That is the whole meaning of it. The world throws people away for the very qualities that, rightly seen, are their strength. They found 4 of the 6 cattle, over a hard week, Elias and Tom and even old Asa riding the timber and the coolies in the cold. And they lost 2, and the loss hurt. And it hurt worse because Elias could not go to the sheriff, because the sheriff owed Voss and everyone knew it. And there is a special kind of helplessness in knowing exactly who wronged you, and knowing that the law is his and not yours. But they found 4, and they mended the fence stronger, and they did not break. Voss, watching from the south, saw that they did not break, and grew colder and faster still. The hearing was 6 weeks off now. Voss had expected the man to be gone, bankrupt and driven off, the ground fallen into his hand. Instead, the man was still there, still working. And worse, the ugly story about the scheming drifter had begun, here and there, to fray. Because Asa Pike had a mouth on him when he chose to use it, and the old blacksmith had begun to tell anyone who would listen exactly what he had told Elias on the porch. And because young Tom Aldis's family and the other downstream ranchers whose water ran clear again were beginning slowly to do the arithmetic of who had actually helped them, and who had spent years quietly trying to own them. The tide had not turned, but it had, in a few hearts, begun to slacken. And Harlan Voss, who could feel the temperature of a town the way Elias could feel water in the ground, felt it slacken, and knew he had to strike the decisive blow before the story got away from him entirely. But before he did a thing he almost never did, a thing that was itself a sign of how the certainty in him had begun to crack. He came in person. One gray afternoon, Harlan Voss rode up the ridge alone. No land agent, no hands. Just the smiling, powerful man on a good horse. And he sat in Elias Crane's dooryard the way the agent had months before. And he looked around at the mended house, and the full barn, and the clear water. And for once the smile was thinner than usual. And Elias came out and stood on his own porch and did not offer coffee. Because there are men you do not offer coffee. And the 2 of them looked at each other a long moment across the yard. The scarred man who had been given nothing, and the smooth man who had taken everything. And it was, in its quiet way, the truest confrontation in the whole story. Because there was no crowd to perform for, and no law to hide behind. Just 2 men and the plain truth of what each of them was. Voss spoke first, because men like Voss always speak first. They cannot bear a silence they did not author. He said, pleasant, reasonable, "You have done a fine thing with this place, Crane. I mean that.
I have watched a lot of men fail on this ground, and you are the first who did not. That is worth something.
That is worth a great deal, in fact, and I am prepared to pay you for it. More than it is worth. Enough that you could go anywhere and start again. Anywhere at all. A country where a man is not known, where a face like yours could start clean. And there it was, the softest and the cruelest offer of all, wrapped up kind. A country where a face like yours could start clean. The offer to a scarred man of the one thing a scarred man is supposed to want above all others, escape from being looked at. And Voss watched Elias's face to see it land, because Voss had built his whole life on knowing what people wanted and giving them just enough of it to lead them where he needed them to go. But Elias Crane did not want that anymore. And that was the thing Voss had failed to account for, the thing that had already beaten him, though he did not know it yet. Elias Crane looked at the smiling man and said, quiet, "You think I want to go somewhere I am not known?" It was not a question. Voss said, easy, "Any man in your position would." And Elias said, slower, "A year ago, you would have been right. A year ago, I would have taken your money and been 3 counties gone by dark, because a year ago I did not have a single thing worth being known for." He came down off the porch then, not threatening, just closing the distance so the man would have to hear him plain, and he said, "But I am known here now. I am known as the man who mended this creek and walked into a blizzard for the Aldous cow. And I am going to be known, if she will have me, as the man who married the finest woman in this valley. And a man does not sell the one place on earth where he is finally known for something good. You cannot understand that. I can see you cannot. You have spent your whole life making people afraid of you, and you have never once in that life been known for a single thing a man would be proud to have carved on his stone. That is not my sorrow, Voss. That is yours. Now get off my ground." And I want you to notice, friend, that Elias Crane did not raise his voice one single time in the whole of that speech, and that he was never quieter than in its last 3 words, and that Harlan Voss, who had faced down bankers and judges and hard men with guns, could not for a moment meet the eye of the scarred man in that dooryard, and turned his good horse and rode down the ridge, and something in him, some certainty that had never once wavered in 30 years of taking what he wanted, had cracked. Because he had just met the one kind of man his money could not move, the man who has stopped being afraid of losing what little he has, because he has finally decided that little is worth more than anything a coward could offer for it. Voss rode home that afternoon knowing, though he would not admit it even to himself, that he could not buy this man and could not frighten this man. And it was that knowledge, that helpless, galling knowledge, that drove him at last to his cruelest and most respectable weapon, the one that did not require Elias Crane's consent at all, the one aimed not at the man he could not move, but at the woman he thought he could. So he reached for his surest weapon, the one he had held in reserve, the cruelest and the most respectable of all. He reached for the law and the church together, and he arranged, through the 90-day claim and a whispered word to the right officials and a generous donation to the right cause, for the matter to be brought forward not as a mere title dispute now, but as a question of the woman's welfare. Voss's people filed a petition of concern, they called it, respectable as a Sunday hat, arguing that Nora Vale, being deaf and widowed and alone, and clearly under the influence of a disfigured man of unknown origin and doubtful intent, was not competent to manage her own affairs or protect her own property, and that a guardian ought to be appointed to oversee her lands and her decisions for her own good. And can you guess, friend, Who had quietly arranged to be the man of standing recommended to serve as that guardian? Of course you can. It was breathtaking in its cold way. If it worked, Voss would gain legal control of Nora's 10 acres and her headgate without buying a thing, would separate her from Elias by law, would brand their bond as the very proof of her incompetence, and would do all of it wearing the face of a concerned Christian neighbor, protecting a poor, afflicted widow from a scheming stranger. It was villainy so respectable that half the town would thank him for it. And the hearing on the title and the petition on the widow's competence were set, by Voss's careful arrangement, for the very same day, on the courthouse steps and in the courthouse hall, so that Harlan Voss might take the man's land and the woman's freedom in a single morning, before the whole assembled valley, as a lesson to anyone else who ever thought to stand against him. When Elias understood what the petition meant, that it was not just his land now, but her very self, her freedom, her right to choose her own life, that Voss meant to have her declared a thing to be managed, the cold, quiet anger in him went to a place it had never been. Nora, when she read the paper, went white and then very still. And then she did a thing that broke Elias's heart and steeled it in the same moment. She signed, slow, "Are they going to say I am not a person?" And he had no sign big enough to answer that, so he took both her hands in both of his scarred ones and held them still, which is its own kind of speech, and then he signed the only thing there was to sign. "No, we stand, together." And she read it, and her chin came up, that chin the whole valley had mistaken for coldness, and never once understood was courage. So they made ready for the day, the two of them and the old man and the boy, and the few downstream ranchers whose consciences had begun at last to wake. Nora and Asa worked in the evenings, the two of them who spoke her language, going over and over what she would say and how she would say it. Asa's voice ready to carry her hands to a hearing crowd, and Elias built his case in the tin box, the bill of sale and the filing and the scrap of cloth, and the record of the county book where Voss's own name sat on the bought debt like a signature on a confession. And none of them slept much, and the night before, Elias sat on the porch alone a long time and let himself be afraid, all the way afraid, the way he had not let himself be since the fire, because that is the other side of standing in the doorway of the burning house. That is what it costs. You can be burned again. And he had chosen it, and now the flames were coming, and he sat in the cold and was afraid, and did not run. And that, friend, that sitting still in the fear and not running, is the truest courage there is. Far truer than the kind that does not feel the fear at all. Nora came up onto the porch and found him there in the cold dark, because she always knew through the soles of her feet and the sense she had when something was wrong in the man. And she sat down beside him without a lamp, and in the dark they could not sign, so she simply took his scarred hand in both of hers and held it. And they sat like that a long while. Two people who had each been burned once, and had each decided, against all their hard-won caution, to stand in the doorway of the burning house one more time, together. And there is a particular kind of courage that only exists between two people, that neither could summon alone. And they were finding it now, in the dark, before the hardest day of their lives. The courage that comes not from being unafraid, but from being afraid beside someone who is afraid with you. And I will tell you a small thing about that night that I have saved, because it tells you what they had become to each other. At some point, Elias signed, in the dark, feeling for her hands, "Whatever happens tomorrow." And he signed it anyway, though he could not see if she read it. "Whatever happens tomorrow. I have already got more than I ever thought this life would give me. Just these months. just this: if they take the land, they cannot take these months. And Nora, who felt the shapes of some of those signs against her palms in the dark, understood enough, and she brought his scarred hand up and laid it flat against her own chest, the way she had done that first day at the creek, over her heart, so he could feel it beating, steady and unafraid. And that was her whole answer, that steady heart under his ruined hand in the dark, and he understood it, and it was enough to carry him into the morning. They were not alone in it either, and that is worth your knowing before we go to the steps. Word had gone quietly around the downstream ranches over those last weeks, carried by Tom and his father and old Asa, the plain word of who had actually mended the valley's water, and who had actually tried to steal it. And one by one, the men who owed their held ground to Elias Crane had made up their minds. Not loudly, not in any way that reached Voss's ears, but firmly, the way plain men decide the things that matter, that when the day came, they would stand where a debt like theirs said a man ought to stand. It is a fine thing, friend, and a rare one, to do a good turn for a person freely, and years later find it come back to stand beside you when you need it most. And Elias Crane, who had walked into a blizzard for a cow asking nothing, was about to learn that a kindness handed across in the dark as a way of walking back to you in the light, exactly when the dark is deepest. Not because he had earned a trade, he had never once thought of it as a trade, but because that is how goodness moves through a valley, slow and underground like water, and then one day it comes up clear, right where you are standing. And that is the morning I opened this story on. The courthouse steps, the auctioneer, the crowd that laughed. Now you know how they came to be there, and now you know what was truly at stake, which was never really the water or the acres at all. It was whether two people the world had thrown away would be allowed to choose each other, or whether the cold and patient power of a respectable man would be permitted, one more time, to decide who was worth what, and to take from the discarded the one thing they had dared to build. I told you we would come back to the beginning, and here we are. And I told you there was light on the other side of the dark. And there is. But you have to earn it the way they earned it. So let me tell you exactly how that morning went. Slow, the way it deserves. They came into town, all of them, in the cold, bright light of that winter morning. Elias, in his one clean shirt, the burned side of his face turned to the wind, not hidden. Never again hidden. Nora beside him, in her gray dress with her chin up. Asa Pike and Tom Aldis and Tom's whole family. And one by one, quietly, several of the other downstream ranchers whose water ran clear. And on the other side, filling the courthouse steps in their Sunday best, the good people of Cedar Hollow, come to watch the show. And at the center of them, calm and courteous and certain, in a clean collar, tipping his hat to the churchwomen, Harlan Voss. The title hearing came first, on the steps, in the open, the way Voss had arranged it for maximum effect. The county man read out the claim, the old, dead debt, the cloud on the title, and he asked whether the current owner, Mr. Elias Crane, had any answer to the claim or whether the parcel should revert and be sold at auction to satisfy the estate. And the auctioneer, a Voss man, lifted his gavel, and the crowd, half of them primed by a season of poison to enjoy the scarred schemer's downfall, laughed and murmured, and someone called out something ugly. And that is the moment. That is the exact moment I opened on. Elias Crane lifted his hand, instead of letting the gavel fall, and he said, in a voice like a fence post going into hard ground, quiet enough that the crowd had to hush itself to hear him, which is the only kind of quiet that ever truly silences a crowd. Before you sell my life out from under me, you will answer for the lie you told to get it." And they laughed. Of course they laughed. He was a ruined-faced nobody, and Harlan Voss owned the world. But Elias Crane was not talking to the crowd. He had learned long ago that you do not win a crowd by shouting louder than it. You win it by being simply and immovably right, and by making the truth so plain that the crowd cannot unsee it. He reached into his coat, and he took out the tin box, and he opened it there on the courthouse steps, and he began, in his flat, steady voice, to lay the truth out one plain piece at a time, the way he would have laid stone in a channel. Either it holds or it does not. He held up the bill of sale, clean and filed. He held up the county record, dated, legal. He held up the notice of the claim, and he said, plainly, that the debt behind it had been bought, not by any estate, but by Harlan Voss himself, and that he could prove it, because the transfer had been filed in the county book that any man present could walk inside and read. A murmur went through the crowd at that, because it is one thing to hear a rumor, and another to be told that the proof is 30 feet away on a shelf. Then he held up the scrap of good store-bought cloth, and he told them, flat and unhurried, about the cut fence and the driven-off cattle and the shod tracks of more than one man. And he did not accuse, he only laid it down, one piece beside the next, and let them start to see the shape of it. And he named no names of the hands who had done it, not yet, because he had someone who could name them better than he could. And then Harlan Voss made his mistake. Because Voss was not used to being questioned, and he was not used to a nobody standing calm on the courthouse steps, making him look, in front of the whole valley, like exactly what he was. And the slackening tide he had felt in the town he felt again now, sharper, dangerous. And something in the smooth, cold machine of him slipped, just for a moment, the way it does with such men, when the contempt finally cracks the courtesy. Voss stepped forward, and he did not shout, but his voice carried. And he said, with a curl of the lip that the whole front of the crowd saw, "This is a farce. Are we truly going to stand here and weigh the word of a disfigured drifter, and a deaf woman who cannot even hear the charges against her?"
She does not know what she owns. She never has. People like that are put on this earth to be managed by their betters, and I intend to see her properly managed, for her own good, whether she likes it or not. People like that. It went very quiet on the courthouse steps, because there it was, at last, in the open, in his own voice, in front of everyone, the contempt under the courtesy, the true face under the clean collar, the thing the friendly hat had always been hiding. The good people of Cedar Hollow had been willing to believe a great deal about the scarred man, but they were, most of them, when it came right down to it, decent, and a decent person can forgive almost anything, except the sight of the powerful sneering at the helpless out loud. And Harlan Voss had just done it, in daylight, on the courthouse steps, before the whole valley, about a poor, deaf widow they had all known for years. And here is the part I have been saving for you the whole long way, the part that is the true heart of it, so lean in close. Nora Vale had been reading his lips. She could not hear a word Harlan Voss said, but she had read every single one of them off his mouth, clear as print. People like that, put on this earth to be managed by their betters, whether she likes it or not. And this woman who had spent 25 years being talked about as if she could not understand, being pitied and dismissed and managed, and told what she was worth by men with clean collars, This woman who had been called less her whole silent life. She stepped forward. She stepped forward past Elias, out to the front of the courthouse steps, small and straight-backed in her gray dress, and she raised her hands, and she began to speak in the only voice she had, her hands moving swift and sure. And Asa Pike, who had loved a deaf woman for 40 years and knew every sign she made, stepped up beside her and spoke her words aloud to the crowd, plain and steady, so that not one person there could fail to understand. She signed, and Asa spoke it. I have been deaf since I was 6 years old. I have not heard a voice in 25 years, but I have watched mouths my whole life, and I have never in all that time read a truer sentence off any man's lips than the one this gentleman just spoke, when he told you what he thinks of people like me. The crowd was silent as a church. She went on, her hands sure, Asa's voice carrying. He says I do not know what I own. I know exactly what I own. I own 10 acres and the water that runs to every ranch below me, and this man has offered to buy it 3 times, and I have said no 3 times. And because a woman like me is not allowed to simply say no, he has decided I must be managed. He says I cannot protect my own property. I have protected it against him for 2 years alone. And I will tell you now who cut the fence on this man's pasture and drove off his cattle in the night, because I read it off the mouths of the men who did it, boasting in the store where they thought no deaf woman could hear. And she named them, 2 of Voss's own hands by name, and the crowd turned to look at the 2 men, who had come to watch the show and now stood white-faced at the edge of it. And the 2 men's faces, in that moment, told the whole valley everything. Because a guilty face cannot be argued with, and there is a bitter justice in the fact that the deaf woman convicted them with the very silence they had counted on. And you could feel it moving through that crowd now, the thing that moves through a crowd when it begins, all at once, to understand that it has been lied to. It is a physical thing, a shifting of weight, a turning of shoulders, a murmur that changes its pitch. These were not bad people, most of them. They were ordinary people who had been handed a story by a man they trusted, the story of the scheming drifter and the helpless widow. And they had believed it, the way ordinary people believe the stories handed to them by powerful men, without examining it, because examining it was uncomfortable, and believing it was easy. But now the widow they had been told was helpless was standing in front of them, convicting a rich man's hired hands off the shapes of their own boasting mouths, and the widow they had been told could not manage her own affairs was managing this courthouse better than the county man was. And the widow they had been told did not know what she owned, had just told them, plainly, exactly what she owned, and exactly who had spent 2 years trying to take it. And every word of it had the unmistakable ring that lies never have, and truth always does. And one by one, the ordinary people of Cedar Hollow felt the story they had swallowed turn over in their stomachs and begin to come back up. There was a woman near the front, a farmer's wife, who had a deaf sister of her own back east that the family had put away in an institution long ago and never spoken of again. And she stood there listening to Nora Vale and put her hand over her mouth and began, quietly, to weep, for a sister and a shame she had carried 30 years. There was a young man who had laughed the loudest 20 minutes before, and who now could not remember why he had thought it funny. There was old Mrs. Prentice, the churchwoman, the one from the flour barrels, standing rigid and red, hearing her own cruel words come back to her in the light of what they had really served. And there was, standing at the back where he thought no one marked him, the storekeeper, the one Elias had told to ask her,
remembering the day he had learned to look a deaf woman in the face, and understanding now, fully, what he had almost gone on failing to see. A crowd is a slow animal, but it is not a stupid one, not forever. And there comes a moment when the slow animal wakes, and it was waking now on those courthouse steps in the cold, bright winter light. And Harlan Voss, standing at the center of it in his clean collar, could feel it waking under his feet like ground going soft. And for the first time in 30 years, the smooth, calculating machine of him had nothing to reach for, no lever to pull, no fear to press, because you cannot frighten a crowd that has just stopped being afraid, and you cannot buy a truth that has already been spoken out loud in front of everyone. Then she turned, and she looked at Elias Crane, at the burned side of his face turned full to the morning light, unhidden, and she signed, and old Asa's voice went rough as he spoke it aloud. This man learned my language one word at a time, with hands that bled to bring me clear water. This man is the only person in this valley in 25 years who looked at my face before he looked at my land. He showed me his deepest wound when he had no reason to, but to make me know he was true. He did not want my 10 acres. He wanted me. And I have chosen him, freely, in front of all of you. Not because I am managed, not because I am helpless, not because I could not do better, but because he is the best man I have ever known, and because a woman like me gets to choose too. A woman like me gets to choose too. I want you to sit with that line the way that crowd sat with it, because it is the whole story folded into 8 words, and there was not a soul on those courthouse steps who did not feel it land. And then the thing happened that Harlan Voss, for all his careful reading of towns, had never once accounted for, because men like Voss never do. The tide did not just slacken, it turned. It was old Asa Pike who moved first, stepping to stand at Elias's shoulder, arms folded, one word.
Huh. Then it was Tom Aldous and his father and his whole family coming up out of the crowd to stand behind the scarred man and the deaf widow. Then it was one downstream rancher and another, the men whose water ran clear, coming to stand on the side of the 2 people who had actually helped them. Then it was the churchwoman herself, the one who had cornered Nora by the flour barrels, red-faced now, because she had just heard, in Voss's own mouth, the ugly thing she had been an instrument of. And she came forward too, and later she would offer Nora an apology, humbled and real, and Nora would accept it, because Nora Vale was a bigger soul than the valley had ever bothered to notice. And then, one by one, and then all at once, the good people of Cedar Hollow, the same crowd that had laughed not 20 minutes before, began to turn their backs on Harlan Voss, and their faces toward the 2 the world had thrown away. And someone began to clap. Slow at first, and then not slow. And then another. And then the whole courthouse steps rang with it. The witness turned at last, the crowd that came to jeer staying to cheer. And Harlan Voss stood alone in the middle of it in his clean collar, and for the first time in his life, the town he had owned would not meet his eyes. The county man, no fool and reading the wind, dismissed the petition of concern on the spot as without merit, and announced that the title claim would be examined properly, in the light, with the county book open for all to see, which everyone present now understood meant the end of it, because the county book would show Voss's own name on the bought debt, plain as print, the mark that his own overreach had left. It did show exactly that in the weeks that followed, and more came out once people were willing to look: the cut fence, the paid hands, The whole patient, years-long scheme to strangle a valley into one man's hand. Voss was not dragged off in irons. Men like that rarely are. But his power in Cedar Hollow was broken, because power like his runs entirely on the town's consent, on everyone agreeing to be a little afraid. And the town, having once seen his true face on the courthouse steps, and having once found the courage to turn its back, did not agree to be afraid of him any more. Within a year, he had sold his 12,000 acres and moved on to some other valley that did not yet know him, which is the way of such men. And I will spend no more of our quiet hour on him, because he is not what this story is about, and he never was. This story is about the two who stayed. Elias Crane kept his ground. The title came clear. The water ran clear, all the way down the valley to every ranch that needed it. And it runs clear to this day, they say, because a man once made an honest promise to a creek and kept it. And on a bright morning the following spring, with the drought long broken and the whole valley greening, Elias Crane and Nora Vale were married under the cottonwoods by the clear creek where they had first shared a loaf of bread across the water. And the whole town came, the whole town that had once laughed, and this time nobody laughed. Or, if anybody's eyes were wet, it was the good kind of wet, the release kind, not the weakness kind. Asa Pike stood up for Elias. Tom Aldis held the ring. Gray with the torn ear lay in the spring grass and thumped his tail. And when it came time for the vows, Elias Crane spoke his aloud and signed them at the same time, slow and clumsy and sure, so that his bride could both see them and know he had made them in her own language. And Nora Vale signed hers back, and Asa spoke them for the crowd. And the last thing she signed, looking up into the ruined, unhidden face of the man she had chosen freely in front of the whole world, was the same thing she had signed that first day at the creek. Her open hand flat against her own chest, and then moving out toward him, open, the way you hand a thing across. Thank you. And more than thank you. And then he signed the small, private thing, the shorthand. The two of them alone inside a word the whole crowd could see, and none of them could read. He signed, "Are you cold?" And she signed back, her whole face lit with it, "Not anymore." And that was their vow, the real one, the one underneath the one Asa spoke aloud. And it meant the loneliness and the end of it, and there was not a dry eye among the few who knew what those hands were really saying, which were Asa and Tom. And I think, if you have followed this all the way, you. They put the two parcels together, the mended ranch and the 10 acres with the headgate, one name at last, and the water they held they never once used as a weapon the way Voss would have, but shared it out fair to the whole valley, because they both knew, better than anyone alive, what it is to be at the mercy of someone who holds the thing you need. They were not rich. The ranch was always hard ground, and always would be. But it paid in time, and it held. And there were good years and hard years, and the grief that each of them carried in did not leave. Grief does not leave, I have told you that. It only learns to share the house with other things. But it learned, in that mended house on the ridge, to share the house with a great deal of quiet joy. There were children in time, 2 of them, and both grew up speaking with their hands before they spoke with their mouths, fluent in their mother's silent language from the cradle, so that the sound that filled that house was not sound at all, but something better. A whole family talking with their hands across the supper table, in the lamplight, laughing without a sound, which the neighbors found strange at first,
and then found, when they were honest, that they envied. Tom Aldous grew up and took land of his own down the valley, and named his first son after Elias, and never in his life let anyone speak ill of a man for the look of his face, having learned young and forever that the worth of a man is in his hands, and his steadiness and his kept promises, and never once in his face. Asa Pike lived long enough to sit on that porch many hundred more evenings with gray between him and his friend, saying almost nothing. And when at last the old blacksmith died, it was in that house, in a bed by the window with the morning light coming in, with Elias holding one scarred old hand and Nora holding the other. And the last thing he did was look at the two of them and, too weak to speak, lift one hand and make the shape he had made the very first day up at the new barn, the shape that had been his blessing all along. And that was the finest word anyone ever said over Asa Pike, and everyone in that room knew it. Let me stay in the good years a little longer with you, because I told you I would not rush past the warm parts, and because a story that spends all its length on the trouble and only a breath on the reward has told a lie about which one matters more. The valley changed after that courthouse morning, not all at once and not perfectly, because towns are slow and prideful things, and they do not like to admit they were wrong. But it changed. The water ran fair to everyone now, and the little ranches that Voss had meant to strangle held on and even prospered. And every one of those families knew, whether they said it out loud or not, that they owed their ground to a scarred man and a deaf woman they had once crossed the street to avoid. And a strange and beautiful thing happened. The thing that always happens when a community finally sees someone it had refused to see, which is that, having once been ashamed of how it treated the widow, the valley overcorrected into a kind of fierce protectiveness, so that, within a few years, there was not a soul in Cedar Hollow who would have dared to speak to Nora Crane too loud or too slow. And the children of the valley, who learned faster and cleaner than their parents, took to her language like it was a game. And it became, over time, an ordinary thing to see two children signing to each other across the schoolyard, having learned it from the deaf woman who was, by then, the person half the county went to when they needed something done right. Because that is the other thing that happened. Once the town stopped seeing the scar and the silence, it started seeing what had been there all along, which was two of the most capable people in the whole valley. Elias Crane's word on water became law in that country. When a creek needed reading, when a head gate needed setting, when a dispute over a diversion threatened to turn neighbor against neighbor, it was Elias they sent for. And he would come and walk the ground and read the water the way he had always read it, and set it right. And both parties would abide by it, because everyone knew the scarred man could not be bought and did not lie, and cared only about whether the thing held. And Nora, who had spent 25 years being treated as though she could not understand, became, in the fullness of those years, the woman the valley trusted with its hardest truths. Because a person quickly learns that the one who cannot hear gossip is the one you can safely tell your grief to, and that the one who has read faces her whole life is the one who will know, before you have finished, what you are really trying to say. Women came up the ridge to sit with her. They did not always know her signs, and it did not matter, because Nora Crane now, had a way of sitting with a person and looking at them, actually looking, the way almost no one is ever looked at, that undid people, that let them weep, that sent them home lighter. And the valley that had once pitied her came, in the end, to understand that she was the least pitiable soul among them. and quietly, without ever quite saying so, to be a little in awe of her. There were the children, as I told you. 2 of them, a girl first and then a boy. And I want to give you just one picture of that house in its full life, because it is the picture the whole story was climbing toward. Picture a supper table in the lamplight on an ordinary evening, some 10 years on. The ranch is proven now, not rich, but sound. The barn full, the water clear. At the head of the table is a scarred man, gray coming fully into his hair now, the burned side of his face as much a part of him as the weather, no longer hidden, never again hidden. And there was a look on him, on the whole of him, that the young drifter who rode in with $11 could never have imagined wearing. The look of a man who stopped, who arrived, who has somewhere to be. Across from him, a straight-backed woman, still slight, her dark hair going elegantly gray, and between them 2 children whose hands are flying, because in this house the talk is all hands and faces, the children signing over each other the way hearing children shout over each other, and the mother signing back, mock stern, and the father laughing, actually laughing, the good side of his face and the ruined side both, because in this house the ruined side laughs too. And there is no sound to any of it, no sound at all. And it is the fullest, warmest, most alive room in the whole valley, and any hearing family that ever glimpsed it through the window on a winter night went home and sat in their own noisy house and felt, obscurely, that they were the ones who had been missing something. That is what they built, the 2 the town had thrown away. Not a fortune, a room like that. And I ask you, friend, honestly, which of those 2 things would you rather have at the end of your days? And I think you know the answer. And I think it is the answer this whole story has been walking you toward. Nora started a small school, in time, in the front room of the ranch house, and then in a proper building the valley put up, because there were other deaf children in that country, scattered and set apart, and treated as simple the way she had been treated. And she went and found them, one by one, the way Samuel had once found her. And she brought them into the light of language, and she taught them, and she taught their families, and more than one child who would have grown up alone in a full house grew up instead answered and whole, because a deaf widow the town had once wanted to declare incompetent turned out to be the most competent teacher that valley ever had. Do you feel the justice of that, all the way down? They said she could not manage her own affairs. She ended up managing the education of half the county's forgotten children. The world is so often wrong about the ones it throws away, and every so often, if there is any mercy in things, it lives long enough to find out how wrong. Elias and Nora grew old on that ridge. The grief each of them had carried in did not leave. I have told you, and I will tell you once more, because it is one of the truest things I know. Grief does not leave. It only learns to share the house with other things. And in that house, it shared the room with a great deal of joy, and it was not the master anymore, only one more thing at a table full of things. Elias never stopped, on hard nights, feeling the old fire at the edge of him. Nora never stopped, some silent mornings, missing Samuel and the sound of a mother she could barely remember. But they carried those old wounds together now, and a wound carried by 2 is a different thing than a wound carried alone. It is not lighter, exactly, but it is warmer, and that is the whole difference. That is the entire difference between the life they nearly did not choose and the life they had. Gray lived to be very old for a dog, and died in the sun on the porch with his torn ear against Elias's boot, and they buried him up by the head of the clear channel he had barked at the day the water first ran clean, and neither of them was ashamed of how long they grieved a dog, because they both knew that the dog had seen their worth before the humans did. And that is a debt you do not forget. And they got another dog in time, because you do. Because a life keeps asking you to love things that will not outlast you. And the only two answers are to keep saying yes or to lock the door. And they had made their choice about the door a long time ago, up in a gray dooryard, forehead to forehead, and they never went back on it. Now, let me come back to you, friend, wherever you are, in whatever quiet room or long road or dark and sleepless hour you have spent this last while sitting with me, because we have come to the end of the telling, and it is time I said the plain thing this whole story was built to say. They laughed when the scarred rancher chose the deaf widow. The whole valley laughed. And they laughed because they had made the oldest and commonest mistake there is, which is to believe that the worth of a person is a thing that other people get to assign, that a ruined face is a ruined man, that a silence is an emptiness, that a widow alone on 10 acres is a problem to be managed, and not a whole and sovereign soul with the same right to choose her own life as anyone born lucky and whole. They were wrong. They were wrong the way people are so often wrong about the quiet ones, the passed-over ones, the ones the world has thrown away. And I suspect, friend, that you have been on the receiving end of that wrongness at least once in your own life, because nearly everyone has. And if you have, then I want you to hear this next part as if I were saying it to you alone across a fire. Your worth is not a number that other people get to assign to you. It never was. It is not in your face, or your losses, or your silences, or the verdict of some smiling, powerful man in a clean collar who has decided what you are for. Your worth is in what your hands do when no one is watching, in the promises you keep to the small things, in the kindness you hand across the water, asking nothing back. And the great mistake, the mistake the whole valley made, the mistake maybe you have been making about your own self, is to believe that the passed-over life is a lesser life, when the truth, the deep truth this story was built to carry to you, is that the person who has spent a lifetime being looked past is very often the one soul left who truly knows how to see. So, if you are out there tonight feeling thrown away, feeling like the scarred one, the silent one, the one alone on 10 dry acres that nobody wants, I want you to remember Elias Crane crouching by that brown creek and making it one honest promise. Not cursing it, not weeping over it, just doing the next right thing, and then the next. Until one day the people who laughed looked up and found that the discarded man had built the one true thing in the whole valley. And remember, too, that he almost did not. Remember that the locked door voice nearly won, that he sat 3 days on that porch and nearly let the one warm thing freeze, and that it took an old man's plain words and his own hard courage to walk down that ridge and turn his worst wound to the sun. Wanting something after you have been hurt is the bravest thing a person does, braver than moving a creek. And you are allowed to do it. You are allowed to hope, even after all the times hoping cost you. And a life that you choose freely, forehead to forehead in the gray light against the whole laughing world, is worth more than any safe and lonely life you were ever handed or shamed into. Choose it. Whatever your 10 acres are, whatever clear water you have it in you to bring, whatever wounded soul is standing in a doorway waiting to be truly seen, choose it, freely, and let them laugh, because the laughing never lasts, and the water runs clear long after the laughter is gone. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with me. Truly. It means more than you know that you stayed all the way to the end, when so many leave early and miss the part that matters. If this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments where you listened from and who you thought of while you listened. Because I read them, and because none of us is as alone as the dark hour tries to tell us we are. Take care of your people. See the ones the world looks past. Keep your small promises. And when someone stands in your doorway with their worst wound turned to the sun, do not flinch and do not laugh, but lay your 2 hands against it, gently, the way she did, and answer the oldest question there is with the oldest answer. Are you cold? Not anymore. May the water always run clear to your door. Until the next quiet hour, friend, be well and be seen.